In the United States, representations of Asian people or people with Asian ancestry is not great. Though certainly a minority within the US, worldwide Asians make up well more than half of the world, but are in a small amount of leading roles in Hollywood. I mean, even if we're looking at the demographics of the United States, they're disproportionately underrepresented, especially when we talk about leading roles. But beyond just a lack of representation, oftentimes the representation that does exist is negative. Older Asian people are portrayed as dangerous mystics, younger Asian women are portrayed as arousing, delicate beauties, younger Asian men are portrayed as creepy fetishists. Western and Southern Asians are often considered or categorized as not really being Asian, despite, objectively being Asian, and Black Asians are often erased, even though people like Aquafina and Eddie Huang have made their careers off of misappropriating Black American culture. This isn't even touching on the erasure of ethnic minorities such as the Ainu, the Uyghur, the Assyrians, the Tibetans, and the Karen, so as not to offend international audiences by reminding them of genocides. Consider, for example, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the 10th most profitable media franchise of all time and the second most profitable film franchise of all time. These movies and TV shows are not only now staples in US American culture, they're worldwide hits. Avengers Endgame is the highest grossing movie ever. If any franchise should have positive representation of all people, it's this one. Does it? Well, I've talked before about a weird double standard where Wanda can cause deaths in Asia and Africa and it's okay, but it's a step too far to kill Europeans. I've talked about the weird desire to portray Jewish and Latin people as neo-Nazis. I've talked about how, with the exception of Black Panther and Captain Marvel, all of the black women cast in major roles in the MCU are light-skinned. I've talked about how Homecoming stole traits from Miles Morales, how black men are portrayed as universally aromantic, and how they rewrote Monica Rambeau's story from being about an awesome, self-motivated hero to being inspired by her white stepmom. But I haven't really talked about how this franchise portrays Asian cultures and characters. At least, not completely. What better place to start than... Iron Man takes place, in large part, in Afghanistan, where Tony Stark has supplied the US military with weapons of war, and his business partner supplies the Afghani terrorist organization, the Ten Rings. Look, I'm not going to pretend that there are not terrorist organizations in Afghanistan, nor that they should be portrayed as bad guys. They most certainly should. But the Ten Rings? They're not characters. They're shorthand. I've argued before that there's nothing inherently wrong with having villains of color, and that applies to Afghanis as well, but that the problems often lie in the portrayal. Why are the Ten Rings evil? Is it Wahhabism, Qutbism, Salafi jihadism, racism, anti-Semitism? Who knows? These terrorists seemingly exist solely to fill the plot point of Tony Stark needs to be held hostage by someone, and because terrorists exist in Afghanistan. I mean, they exist here in the States, too, but whatever. They serve roughly the same purpose you'd get if Tony was trapped all alone by circumstance, save that then he'd have nobody to blow up. And I feel like I need to be abundantly clear here. I'm not saying we should have been sympathetic to the Ten Rings. I'm not saying we should come away from the movie thinking that terrorist organizations have some good points. They don't. But they're made up of humans. They're motivated by things. Yes, those things are misogyny, racism, and religious discrimination, but they're not robots. The same way that Favreau has Tony and Rhodey mow down drones in Iron Man 2, and the same way that Whedon has the Avengers kill faceless, monstrous aliens, is how Tony kills members of the Ten Rings. We don't understand what they say if we don't speak the language. We don't know why they do what they do. We don't know the extent of their evil, and we shouldn't ask questions to find out any of these things. They're just a blank slate for action scenes. And their victims aren't exactly characters either, save one. We get a bit of humanity from them, at least, as we see a son hug his father, but who are these people? Why are they being oppressed? What happens to them after Tony leaves? Again, we're not supposed to ask these questions. Stopping bad guys? Good. Saving innocents? Good. Iron Man? Good. There's no follow-up. In comes the American superpower to kill a few soldiers, put a little power in the hands of some different people, and then it flies away. Ignore that attacking a terror group without a plan for defense often leads to acts of revenge on the civilians. Ignore that removing a terror threat without plans for rebuilding often leads to the same or simply a different terror organization taking over once more. Ignore that the vast majority of casualties in the war on terror have been civilians. Just be happy that the strong American was able to easily solve your problems with a couple rounds of explosives and some well-placed bullets. Did I mention that this movie and its first sequel were funded by the US military? Of course, Ho Yinsen is a character. A tragic one, sure, whose death is primarily used to motivate Tony Stark, but still, he's Afghani, even though he's played by a Tarani actor, and has a Chinese name. But still, he is a human character with understandable emotions and relatable struggles. He's likable and memorable, and if he weren't the only Afghani character in this film that takes place largely in Afghanistan, that we are supposed to see as human, it'd almost be nice. In fact, there are Muslims that see Yinsen as positive representation, and it's not really the place for me, a Christian, to tell them otherwise. But it's hard to look at Iron Man and not think of it as propaganda for the United States military. But still, a lot of people like this. But you know what representation almost nobody liked? Doctor Strange is a movie that whitewashes the comics. There's no way around that. The Ancient One in the comics is Tibetan, and in the movie is Celtic. 100% whitewashing. But what's bizarre is that, unlike a lot of other creators, Scott Derrickson really wants people to think that he's not racist. Like when Ridley Scott was criticized for casting the leading individuals from the story of Exodus as white, he responded by saying, quote, "I can't mount a film of this budget and say that my lead actor is Mohammed so-and-so from such and such. I'm just not going to get financed." End quote. When Rupert Sanders was mocked for whitewashing Major Motoko Kusanagi, he said, quote, "There are very few actresses with 20 years experience who have the cyberpunk ethic already baked in. I stand by my decision. She's the best actress of her generation." End quote. He was referring to Scarlett Johansson. I mean, when Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were whitewashed, cast members of Age of Ultron responded by chanting racial slurs on television. Yet Derrickson is adamant that he did the right, least racist thing that he could do. To quote him, quote, "The Ancient One and Wong in the comics were 1960s Western stereotypes perpetuating the old Fu Manchu mentor to the white hero, and Wong was the Kung Fu manservant. What was I supposed to do with those? My first thought was to make the Ancient One a woman and middle-aged, not a fanboy's dream girl. My first thought was that would be an Asian woman, but then it felt like it was falling into the Dragon Lady stereotype, the domineering mystical woman with a secret agenda. I wasn't going to perpetuate that stereotype, and it would make it all about a Western character coming to Asia to learn about being Asian. It was a minefield. I needed an actress who could be domineering, secretive, ethereal, enigmatic, mystical. Tilda Swinton. She's above all of us. It suddenly made sense." End quote. Although, if you listen to another one of the writers, see Robert Cargill, the reason they didn't cast an Asian person was because, quote, "He originates from Tibet, so if you acknowledge that Tibet is a place and that he's Tibetan, you risk alienating 1 billion people who think that that's BS and risk the Chinese government going, hey, you know one of the biggest film-watching countries in the world? We're not going to show your movie because you decided to get political." End quote. After all, we don't want to offend people that support cultural assimilation and erasure, right? You know, broken morality and prioritization of money over basic human decency aside, it's not even like having a Tibetan character is a political move, as Cargill phrases it. Tibetan people exist. The Chinese government acknowledges that. Now, they may debate what rights they have to self-determination, how freely they can practice their religion, and how they identify themselves, but they don't pretend they don't exist. Whatever. Cargill also says casting a person of any other Asian ethnicity would be erasure. Yeah, it would be. But why would casting a white person be any better? Doctor Strange still comes to Asia to learn ancient mystical arts with a vague Asian theme. His teacher still lives in Nepal, wears clothes that the costume designer said was inspired by traditional Chinese clothing, real specific there, uses Buddhist iconography, Hindu meditation, traditional Chinese medicine, and Japanese martial arts. The Ancient One is still the bearer of several Asian stereotypes, still contributes to the white person being the best at Asian culture trope, only she's not played by a Tibetan. This was just taking a role away from a very underrepresented minority group. And even funnier, Strange is still taught vaguely East Asian mysticism from an Asian man. From Derrickson again, quote, "As a result, I also felt a great burden to make Wong a major character. He was a worse stereotype than the Ancient One, and I thought we might have to leave him out. So I inverted everything from the comics and made him a librarian and master of the mystical arts and Strange's mentor." End quote. They changed him from the comics, where he was a manservant, to being Strange's mentor, an East Asian master of the mystical arts. He fills in exactly what Derrickson previously, in the exact same interview, had said he tried to avoid with the Ancient One. He's an Asian teaching a Western individual about the mysticism of the East, and that Western individual excels beyond him. I thought that was what you were trying to avoid, Derrickson. He's still essentially the Ancient One, save being Chinese instead of Tibetan, quite a bit younger, and subservient instead of in charge. And yes, the Chinese manservant to the white man is definitely a problematic trope, and I have no problem with that changing, but they somehow give less character for Wong than the comics do, in no small part due to the fact that he's only in this movie for 7 minutes, which is 5 less than Christine, right, and Caecilius. Movie Wong is serious, and that's about it. Comics Wong is serious too, but also sarcastic and sentimental. He's intuitive, he's got his insecurities, he even eventually stops being Stephen's manservant. He has the innate ability to kill the Sorcerer Supreme, and he's so close to Stephen that they talked this out and could move past it. He's been in a love triangle, he's been the manager of a hotel for demons, he's turned evil briefly like every Marvel Comics hero, he's a big fan of abstract art, he's brutally honest but in an empathetic way that lets people become the best versions of themselves. Again, let me be abundantly clear, the servant aspect of Wong is bad. Both the MCU and the comics were right to change that. But Derrickson took so much else away from him just so that he could be the serious mentor, which is a role that was already filled by the Ancient One. Ultimately, Derrickson defends himself by saying, quote, "Asians have been whitewashed and stereotyped in American cinema for over a century, and people should be mad or nothing will change. What I did was the lesser of two evils, but it is still an evil," end quote. And for that, I do give him a small bit of credit. He didn't try to say that what he did was good or that we just don't get it, but he acknowledged his faults. The thing is, though, there is a third option, a very easy way to keep a Tibetan Ancient One without it feeding into the so-called mighty whitey trope. Simply make Doctor Strange Asian American. The problem with the story of the white man becoming better than his Asian peers and teachers at this absurd mixed-matched caricature of Asian cultures is not that an old Asian person gives him advice. Old people give good advice. That's just part of being old. You live long, you learn things. The problem is that this Orientalist theme implies an inherent power or ability unique to the outsider, and when the outsider is white and the insiders are people of color, that innate quality seems tied to whiteness. I'm not hypothesizing on that. It's what a lot of people used to believe, and some people still believe it to this day. You see this in stories about white people going to the Congo and becoming these great adventurers, or white people traveling into East Asia like Strange and becoming these great magicians. But if Stephen is Asian American, you still get the outsider without getting the potential of audiences taking the story as being one about a racial hierarchy. As is, the Doctor Strange film still has a white man travel to Asia, learn Hollywood's versions of Asian spiritualism, and become the leader of an originally Asian cult. He saves Hong Kong, because it's not going to save itself, and appropriates what the movie believes is Asian culture. But if Stephen is Asian American, he wouldn't appropriate. He would be connecting to his roots. He wouldn't be a white savior, he would be a prodigal son. someone that assimilated into US American culture, and perhaps he scorned the religious beliefs of his parents, turned his back on his heritage, and thinks that the practices of his homeland are not for him. Maybe he's been told in school that he doesn't act Asian, whatever that's supposed to mean. But when he decides to embrace his family's culture, he's not journeying into the East to discover long-lost secrets that only white people can unearth. He's appreciating the culture of the people that raised him, and their families. This version would also, obviously, need to have an East Asian writer, director, and costume designer, so we wouldn't be getting a Hollywood version of a homogenized Asia. Obviously, some mixing of cultures can work. It worked really well in Black Panther, but it should be a product of people that are from those cultures or have ancestors from those cultures, not from somebody that set up a mood board with various traditional Chinese outfits on it and started drawing. Given how Marvel handled Doctor Strange, I was not at all surprised with how they handled this. While a few of us were requesting an Asian Doctor Strange with Keanu Reeves and John Cho being popular choices, a lot of people were asking for an Asian Iron Fist. We didn't get one, of course, even though Louis Tan auditioned for the part of Danny Rand, but hey, at least a couple of East Asian people directed an episode of the show. We also got more mystical, vague Eastern culture, implications that the white immigrant is superior at this vague culture, an Indian rival that's jealous that he's just not as good as the white man no matter how hard he tries, and an erasure of Danny's canonical love for Misty Knight so that he can instead be with the light-skinned non-black woman. Though, I'm not surprised. This series, after all, is a spin-off of Daredevil, and like Daredevil, had Jeff Loeb as executive producer. Loeb, according to Daredevil recurring actor Peter Shinkoda,
Jeff Loeb told the writer's room not to write for Nobu and Gao
because
nobody cares about Chinese people and Asian people.
Ignoring the fact that Shinkoda is Japanese-Canadian, not Chinese, this obviously racist EP of course didn't care about good representation on either of these shows. Is it any wonder that every Asian character in the first 2 seasons of Daredevil are either ninja or criminals? And people act like this show is some flawless masterpiece. Wow, this video's getting pretty long, and I haven't even gotten into how in Endgame the Yakuza are used as a way to show off how good Clint is at killing people, and using a katana, of course, or how Far From Home takes a kind-hearted, if a bit of a jock, white romantic rival for Peter and turns him into a creepy Asian American character that has become the fandom's most hated character even though they love people like Mysterio, or how 3 of the 6 Guardians of the Galaxy are played by actors of Asian descent, but they're all non-human aliens. I say non-human like, so Asgardians are aliens, but Asgardians of color still look like humans. Now, while there is a lot of negative rep, though, that doesn't mean that there's no positive rep. Ned in Homecoming is awesome and hilarious. The Ant-Man movies have Kurt, Usman, and Jimmy, all of whom crack me up, which is what you want in a comedy film, even if I did wish Jimmy Woo was a bit closer to a super spy comic counterpart, but whatever. Hogun gets to be just as noble as all of Thor's other friends, and gets the super awesome last stand against Hela. Dina Madani in The Punisher and Ray Nadeem in the 3rd season of Daredevil are lead characters and actually get treated like they are. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. had an East Asian showrunner and 2 East Asian leading actresses, and Claw and Trevor Slattery are both great villains. In Claw's case, his ethnicity has nothing to do with his villainy, and in fact I bet a lot of my audience didn't even know that Andy Serkis was half Iraqi-Armenian. In Slattery's case, in Iron Man 3, the USA's fear of Western Asian terrorists is so strong that they are duped by a half-Indian British man working for an American businessman, claiming to be associated with the Afghani terrorists from Iron Man 1. I know it ticked off a lot of comic fans that this Mandarin wasn't the Fu Manchu character that they wanted from the comics, but I absolutely love how they set up this stereotype, only to reveal that it's a white American using fear to manipulate other Americans. Is it any wonder that this movie was not funded by the United States military? And hopefully the future will be better too. Salma Hayek, Haz Slayman, Kumail Nanjiani, Don Lee, and Gemma Chan are all set to appear in Eternals, and Shang-Chi is getting his own movie, and both of those are being directed by Asian people. A Miss Marvel TV show is in the works, and there's a chance that the lead of the Hawkeye show will be Asian. But regardless of the times that they have done well, or if they do better in the future, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has done poorly on multiple occasions. Criticizing them for their racism doesn't mean you can't like the media. I enjoy Iron Man and Daredevil, but it's a part of responsibly consuming that media. We shouldn't be silent when stories that we enjoy dehumanize or stereotype entire populations of the world, and we shouldn't accept narratives about the inherent goodness in a white man traveling to Asia and making everything better, especially when that narrative is pushed by the United States government. Recognize when stories want you to lower your empathy, or when they reinforce racist tropes, and be careful not to include them in your own narratives as well. Thanks for watching.